Should be recording. There we go. Okay. Do you all still see my screen? Or still see the...
Yes.
Still see session purpose? Okay. We're recording now. So for those who are jumping in on the recording, just the overview of you missed nothing. And this is the recording is just to help provide more context for future QAP discussions, such that when this comes up again for policy development purposes, you have the recording of this discussion information session to reference. So we covered prior to hitting the record button. So yes, so today, to give you more time after you've submitted your 9% applications to be able to investigate this. And then so today's purpose is primarily recognizing this is both could be a discussion about the CORES program itself, as well as a specific provision or how pluses and minuses to taking different approaches to incorporate CORES into the QAP. Just want to clarify that today's discussion purpose is for organizations that are interested in the certification itself, learning more about the details of the program, as well as providing this recording and context for future QAP development discussions. However, today itself is not intended to be a discussion around whether it should be in the QAP and what a provision should look like. So just wanting to make sure we're separating out those discussions, recognizing that we don't have time today to cover all of those. So today is just about focusing on the details of the CORES program itself. Having said that, I just wanted to provide a bit of context up front about why we see this as a logical and helpful next step in the way services has been in the QAP, just building on the work of our predecessors working on DCA QAP policy. So we've had, this is a bit schematic, but basically we started seeing 2016 this as an innovative project concept where the focus was on a limit on one application that would be awarded for providing a plan related to integrating health and housing in their 9% application. And in 2017, it was a similar innovative project concept approach where the limit was 3 applicants, and the focus was on barriers to quality education. Since that point, we saw enriched property services, which was open to all applicants and had both the education track and a health track. So some of the things that we heard were of concerns for the years that this was in the QAP was that the limitations that were in there were not, when there was limits in there, and when we proposed something comparable in the 2021 QAP policy development process, that those limitations weren't consistent with the number of teams that were capable of delivering quality services that residents need. And furthermore, we definitely saw in the applications and everything a lot of variation in the programs, the types of the quality of the services that we were seeing, as well as the capacity either related to the geography or the property itself or related to the project team. Just a lot of variation in capacity to follow through. Definitely one of the most common things was we were requiring commitments to services that residents may or may not need, and furthermore committing to specific partnerships that were multiple years in advance of service delivery. And so in a nutshell, the reason we see CORES as a logical next step to try to begin solving some of those problems is one, really responds to if we think about DCA similar to the way that we think about how housing agencies have approached services for housing providers is, we've always asked housing providers not to, we're not expecting everyone to be the resident services experts themselves, but that partnerships with resident services experts is how we can really do this right. And similarly, we felt that the DCA team, or a fair amount, and have learned a lot from how things have played out in the past few years in reviewing applications, that we wanted to be able to utilize a framework that was developed by people who have specialized in resident services, quality and capacity evaluation, rather than something that we've worked on just ourselves. And then furthermore, related to that we wanted to lean into a framework that provides guidance and resources and financing opportunities that can support housing providers being better capable and better positioned to provide resident services. And of course, most importantly, it's something that by focusing more on the organizational capacity rather than specific partnerships or specific proposals for services to be provided, this is allowing us to do something that's more flexible and adaptable to resident needs, which may evolve and is certainly something we won't have a concrete idea about at the time of submitting a 9% application. So those are just a few opening remarks to provide some context for this discussion. But at this point, I'm just going to turn it over to the CORES team to speak more specifically about the CORES program.
Great. Thanks, Jack. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So I wanted to just say hello and introduce myself, and then I'm going to take my camera off because my computer is not doesn't have the bandwidth today to do both screen sharing and video sharing. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alexandra Nassau-Brownstone. I'm Vice President of Resident Outcomes in the CORES Initiative at Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future, otherwise known as SAFE. I'm joined today by two colleagues, Andrea Ponzer, who is SAFE's President and CEO, and Sarah Attori, who is our Senior Health and Housing Associate, who's going to also be helping me with the presentation. So with that, let me turn off my video and try to share my screen. All right. Can everyone see that?
Yes, we do see your screen.
Great. So first, I want to thank you all for joining us today to learn a little bit more about the CORES certification. We're pleased to have the opportunity to talk with you all today. Today's session is meant to provide a high-level overview and an introduction to CORES. We'll talk about the goals of the CORES initiative, eligibility requirements, the application structure and process. We're going to talk through some of the key required documents and threshold requirements for the certification. We'll also highlight some of the resources for capacity building that are available for organizations, regardless of whether they're seeking CORES or maybe thinking about seeking CORES down the road. My colleague Sarah will be monitoring the chat while I present, at least for the first portion of the presentation, so please feel free to ask questions there. I cannot see the chat, so she'll be monitoring it, and then we may try to address them in real time, but more than likely we'll address most of the questions at the end. So first, for those of you who are not familiar with SAFE, we're a mission-driven collaborative of affordable housing developers that are committed to advancing the creation and preservation of healthy, sustainable, affordable homes that foster equity, opportunity, and wellness for people of limited economic means. Our members own and manage more than 147,000 rental homes and serve over 259,000 people across the country. SAFE focuses on practice-based policy solutions that are driven by the work with our members in a number of areas, including our more traditional housing policy work. We also have a body of work in energy and water, resident outcomes, health and housing, and more recently, the CORES certification, which builds on the learning and growth across our work. We believe that housing is fundamentally a platform for greater resident stability, wellness, and economic mobility. About 7 years ago, SAFE launched our Resident Outcomes Initiative to demonstrate the value and the impact of resident services at a national level. And there are a number of components to our outcomes work. One component is a common data collection project, which started in 2015 to use data to demonstrate the power of service-enriched housing and to help protect and expand policy and funding that supports resident services coordination. We recently released a report, The Impact of Home, that highlights some of the key findings from our outcomes work, which may be of interest to you. So Sarah's going to go ahead and share that link in the chat. Another component of the Outcomes Initiative is our development of a framework and a companion set of guidelines for a system of resident services coordination, which we published in 2018. And this was the culmination of a three-year community of practice in which we engage with our members and other practitioners and stakeholders across the field to lay out the key decisions, the functions, capacities that are needed to support a robust system of service coordination. The framework that was developed articulates an approach of how resident services should function in an organization, integrating it into the development process with the asset management and with the operations of the property. And the framework and the body of work supporting its development is the foundation that we built upon for the CORES certification. We're going to walk through the framework, and we'll also map out how the framework shapes and relates to CORES as we go on in our presentation in a little bit. So what's CORES? CORES is a certification that recognizes owners and third-party providers that have developed a robust commitment, capacity, and competency in providing resident services coordination in an affordable housing setting. We developed the CORES initiative with several objectives in mind. First, to establish a common language, understanding, and standards for the field. We wanted to support stronger resident services operations that help and be able to help communicate those structures and processes with external stakeholders such as funders, investors, other partners, and to engage with policymakers and regulators. Part of the goal was to support and attract new sources of stable funding. We know it's very hard to fund resident services, and also to continue to demonstrate the impact of stable, affordable housing enriched with services for families and seniors. So I'd like to start by defining what we mean when we say a system of resident services coordination. The field has grown and professionalized and become better integrated into the other business lines and functions of affordable housing development. And while many years ago, it really started with just a focus around the frontline resident service staff, and we know that this is critically important, a system of service coordination includes all the functions that are tied to the mission of providing resident services and housing. So in addition to your frontline staff, that includes the corporate support, the management, quality assurance, IT, HR, really the integration of resident services with the other organizational functions. It's the training and the capacity building for your staff. It's the programs and services, sometimes curriculum that's being developed and scaled across properties. It's the partnership and relationship building, the trust building that you're doing in communities. It's the use of data and research that's used to shape programming and investment. It can be technology systems. This might be data management and outcomes tracking. It might be communications platforms. And it's the sustainable funding sources, the magic that so many of you all do by creating this patchwork of funding sources and increasingly finding ways to include a significant portion into the operating costs at a property. So this is the framework that I mentioned earlier. It was developed in 2018 along with a companion set of guidelines, which Sarah will share in the chat. It's essentially a decision-making framework that articulates how many organizations decide when and where to provide services and articulates an approach to how resident services is often implemented and functions in an organization, both at the corporate, organizational, and at the property levels. The framework is resident-centered and highlights how organizations use data and feedback from residents to help identify priorities for the programming and partnerships in their engagement strategies. The steps in green typically happen at the organizational or corporate level, and the steps in blue typically happen at a property level. It's also important to point out that for this tool, we've simplified and perhaps in some cases oversimplified a process that is complex, it's iterative, and it's interactive. There's interaction and collaboration in the processes that typically happen between the corporate and property levels, and there's also ongoing collaboration between staff and residents. We're going to walk through this framework and its application in CORES in more detail later, but we start here because it's the foundation of CORES. I also want to flag that SAFE is in the process of updating this tool to better highlight and articulate the collaborative nature of the process and really explicitly call out opportunities for deeper engagement and partnership with residents in the shaping of both resident services and the culture of operations at a property. Today, we're sharing the original version, but we expect to have the updated tool later this spring. So, CORES is a 5-year certification, and it applies to the organization. It is not a property level certification, and that is something that I will reiterate probably a few times today. It's often a point of confusion. We are certifying the organizational capacity, the infrastructure, and approach to resident services. It's that sort of proven track record of doing this work, of integrating it with your mission and your business model in at least some portion of your portfolio. You may have heard about CORES in conjunction with the Fannie Mae Healthy Housing Rewards Initiative. CORES is one of the requirements for their Healthy Housing Rewards Enhanced Resident Services, or ERS financing, which is essentially a discount of up to 30 basis points for sponsors using the financing. Their goal is to provide a sustainable source of funding for resident services that supplements an owner's existing commitments. In addition, CORES is being used in state low-income housing tax credit QAPs, which is why we're here today. We're talking with several states, and CORES has already been included in both Virginia and Maryland in their QAP applications. There are a wide variety of models and ways that an organization can operationalize their resident services programs. And for CORES, we've defined 3 of the most common models, and these have become 3 pathways for applying to CORES. So we call these direct, hybrid, and third party. I'm going to go through each of these. So for direct, this is a situation where the affordable housing organization, the owner, the developer, has also developed a core capacity to do resident services coordination in at least some portion of their portfolio. That means that they have corporate or organizational level staff that are overseeing the resident services function. They're thinking about, you know, the goal setting, the theories of change, the outcomes tracking, the training and capacity that they're also then providing for their frontline resident services coordinator, or whatever term you're using for your frontline staff. The frontline staff also are hired and roll up into that somehow into that parent organization. They're not hired through an entirely separate organization. That's what we consider direct. And in that case, that developer, that sponsor is the entity that's seeking CORES certification. The hybrid model is another pathway for an owner. In this case, they have all of those sort of organizational corporate level functions that they've developed and they keep in-house, but they may hire the frontline staff through a third party, through another organization. The way that this most commonly presents is that an owner uses a third-party property management company at their site, and for sort of ease of reporting and HR and hiring, they're hiring the resident services staff through that property management. But there's really a co-management that's happening between the owner and the frontline staff. And so there's a separate model to really reflect the accountability, alignment, management that needs to take place to make that function well. And a third-party model is where an owner has a commitment to doing resident services. They're putting, you know, together some resources, funding, but they haven't developed the real robust system of resident services, or they may be operating in a place, in a geography, a location where there's a really strong provider. And so they've hired, they're providing resources and contracting with an organization that's going to come in and bring in all elements of the resident services function. There should be some interaction and negotiation and accountability between the owner and the third party, but the third party really has more autonomy, that organizational level oversight, in addition to managing the frontline staff. They're doing all the data tracking, et cetera. It's important to note that, one other thing. I'd like to clarify, a third party, this is not a YMCA that's coming in to do a fitness class. Those are terrific partnerships. We all work with partners. And in any one of these models, direct, hybrid, third party, in addition to sort of the core resident services function, it would be anticipated, expected that you're working with a variety of different partners at the site. So a third party does not apply to a YMCA that's doing a fitness class. But you might have an organization like a YMCA that has developed a business of doing more robust services in a housing setting. And in that case, they might be eligible to seek a third-party CORES certification. It's also possible that an organization fits in more than one of these models. One of the things that we have built into the CORES application process, we anticipate, is that when an organization is thinking about applying, we will set up a TA call if requested to talk to the organization to help them sort of figure out which model they might fit, what's the best path forward. So the CORES certification is about 50 questions. It's a variety of formats, and it's split into 6 sections. There are 9 threshold or minimum requirements, and the cost of the certification, 5-year certification, is $5,500. I'm going to walk through the thresholds now. First, under the direct or hybrid model, we're looking for an organization to have at least 3 years experience as a multifamily provider. If they're applying under a third-party model, they should have at least 3 years experience doing that. They need to be able to fit or apply under one of these models, direct, hybrid, or third-party. They need to have at least 3 years of experience doing resident services coordination. So you might have been an owner and a developer for 15 or 20 years, but be a little newer to the resident services space. We're looking for organizations that have at least a 3-year history of providing resident services coordination, because we feel that's important for building up some of these systems. It takes some time. Organizations must have resident services and support at more than one property. We designed this requirement to be achievable, recognizing that organizations are of varying sizes and scales. We don't have a minimum percentage or threshold, but we're looking to understand sort of we ask with a template that we provide sort of the total number of properties, the total number of properties with resident services coordination, and we are looking at what percentage of your properties in an organization have made a commitment to provide resident services. It's really to sort of illustrate the capacity and commitment around resident services in the organization. And then we have 4 key property level documents or tools, what we call the community scan, resident opportunities and needs assessment, property services plan, and the resident indicators and analysis report. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about those 4 documents because a lot of questions typically come up around those. In addition to the threshold questions, questions deal with a number of core competencies. We're looking at the organizational structure. How is resident services articulated as part of the business model and mission? We're looking at the staffing infrastructure, the capacity and training, support, and accountability. We're looking at how an organization is using scaled systems. This might be technology, a curriculum, certain kinds of processes that support multiple properties. We're going to look at how an organization is using community data, resident demographics, direct feedback, and engagement with residents to shape priorities and programmatic decision-making in properties. We look at how an organization develops and manages partnerships, the use of data to track and understand impact, and their approaches to thinking about and sustainably funding resident services. And finally, we're also, throughout all of this, looking for an organization to demonstrate how they're operationalizing a resident-centered approach to engagement and programming. So in talking with practitioners who've gone through the application process and become CORES certified, we've identified a number of ways that organizations find value in CORES. CORES is a signal that an organization has achieved the highest level of commitment and is meeting industry best practice. It serves as an external validation of the quality and the system's approach for services. CORES organizations understand the value of partnerships that center resident outcomes. And in order to achieve certification, organizations are evaluated on the process for selecting partners and their process for aligning goals and sharing data. CORES can be used to help bring together committed organizations and partner to improve resident outcomes in a more meaningful way. Organizations are data-driven, and they leverage data to make more informed decisions about operations and programming, prioritizing measurable impact on residents' health and well-being. CORES puts forth a process that guides data collection and helps organizations to set goals for improvement, for deepening impact, and communicating meaningfully about that impact both internally and also externally to different audiences. And finally, CORES can be used to unlock opportunities for partnerships in funding and financing, like Fannie Mae's Healthy Housing Rewards and earning points for low-income housing tax credit applications. So now we're going to spend a few minutes walking through the framework and mapping how CORES aligns with the tool. Again, here's the framework. These are the steps that many organizations are taking to determine when, where, how they're going to implement resident services across their portfolio. It's designed to leverage elements of infrastructure that can be replicated and scaled, but also recognizes and centers the unique priorities of each community. So we're zooming in and starting at the top green circles, the steps that typically happen at the organizational level. And the steps start with determining the organizational goals for resident outcomes. This includes thinking about high-level goals, the integration of resident services across the other functions of the organization. How is resident services integrated into the business model and the mission of the organization? And as an owner evaluates any specific property that either they're acquiring or that already exists in their portfolio, how do they evaluate the need and opportunity in the community to determine whether or not to prioritize resident services? And then what's the model or the intensity of resident services that should be supported as a goal? This often starts with looking at a lot of community level data, and we've listed a lot of resources here that developers frequently use. This is not an exhaustive list, but a great starting place. It's also worth saying organizations often, when possible, really try to engage with residents and the community directly, in addition to supplement this larger fact-gathering effort. So how do the CORES questions and requirements map against this? We asked for an organizational chart that helps to demonstrate where the resident services function sits in the organization, and we're looking at that in conjunction with a portfolio profile, which is a template we provide that to better understand how the staffing supports on-site programming and initiatives. We ask for an example of the privacy protocols that you're using and sharing with staff. This relates to an organization's data management and management of resident data, their training for staff in this area. We ask for a scope of work or a job description that demonstrates the role, responsibilities, and required qualifications for frontline resident services staff. How an organization is thinking about their staffing capacity, qualifications, training, all of that. We ask for an example of organizational goals or a theory of change, might be a logic model. This is really the organizational level goal setting tool. And we ask for what we call a community scan. And this can be completed at the corporate level, or it might be completed at the property level. And it includes identification of resources, potential partners, assets, community level data. This is often done as a part of pre-development. Some portions, though typically not all, might be included in a market analysis study. The items that have a red asterisk are the documents that are required and relate to the threshold requirements that we've walked through. So here we're moving into the steps that typically happen at the regional or the property level. And this is where an organization is synthesizing that community level data with the property level data. It's resident demographics, direct feedback from residents, partner data, et cetera. And they're using that to shape a specific property level plan. And that includes partnership development, ongoing engagement with residents, and the prioritization of goals, resources, and programming. These steps also include the ongoing assessment of programming and services, how an organization is tracking their impact in the resident services initiative at this property. Measuring impact is, of course, used for fundraising, but more importantly, it's used for very practically to drive and refine programming priorities from year to year, and for an organization to hold itself accountable to its own goals. So again, how does CORES, how do the questions and requirements map against this? This is the portion of the framework where we find the 4 key threshold documents that I mentioned earlier: the community scan, the resident opportunities and needs assessment, property services plan, resident indicators, and analysis report. We're going to talk through each a little bit here, but go into more detail in a later slide or a series of slides. So the community scan, we already talked about this because, as I mentioned, you might find this, an organization might complete this at a corporate level, or it might be completed more at a property level. Frequently, it's collaboration between the two, but we include it in both places depending on how an organization thinks about it. Resident opportunities and needs assessment. This is one of the 4 key documents. I'm going to skip over it for now, and we'll talk about it in just a few minutes. We ask for an executed MOU or service agreement. This is an example agreement with an external partner that demonstrates that an organization is really being thoughtful in their development of their partnerships. And this might be an example of you have developed a partnership with the local YMCA to do fitness programming or nutrition. We're looking to see how an organization is thinking about their alignment of mission and goals with their partners, how they're articulating roles and responsibilities. Often these agreements should include a section that's dealing with goals, tracking impact, and sharing data. And of course, they should be dealing with insurance and liability. Property services plan. This is, again, one of the key threshold documents. I'm going to skip it for now. The resident indicators and analysis report. We'll talk more in a moment, but I want to distinguish this from the impact analysis report. The resident indicators and analysis is an impact report at a property level, one property. And the impact report is an analysis an organization might have done at a portfolio level. So it might be rolling up data from multiple programs or initiatives across the portfolio. It could also be a specific program report, a program that's being operated at multiple sites. For example, you've developed an after-school program that operates at 5 sites, and you want to look at the impact of that program, that unique program across those 5 sites. That would be what we would consider an impact analysis across multiple properties rather than the property level report. Okay, so now we're going to dig in a little bit more deeply into the 4 key documents, since this is the place where a lot of organizations have questions. So we ask for an organization to pick one property from their existing portfolio to demonstrate the use of these 4 documents. Each of these tools should be for the same property for the sake of the application. You are representing that this is part of your process and that you are using these tools across your portfolio where you're doing resident services, but you're demonstrating it at one, and you have full autonomy to choose whichever property you want to feature. You may not have a document or a tool that you call a community scan or a resident opportunities and needs assessment. That's our language, and that's okay. You might have something that aligns almost exactly, but you call it something else, or you may use the same elements that are listed here and you package them in different ways. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Essentially, we want to see the tools that your organization uses to achieve the intended functions of these 4 documents. So we're going to start with the community scan. This includes community level data to understand the surrounding neighborhood. This might be census data, information. It might be information gathered from a community health assessment that was completed recently. You might pull data through a dashboard like Enterprise Opportunity 360 tool. It also includes identification of resources, potential partners, and assets in the community. Are there nearby schools? What's the quality of the schools? Transit, access to grocery stores and pharmacies, healthcare, et cetera. And to what extent that it's possible to assess the quality of the partners and community institutions. This might be done through some initial online vetting. It also often requires engagement with residents and other community stakeholders. And this should be done at least once every 6 years to keep it refreshed. The resident opportunities and needs assessment includes 1, resident demographics. A snapshot, a tool to understand who's living in the property. And often organizations are leveraging their property management compliance data for that. That's fine. Sometimes there's an integration into another system where they're also using surveys directly to residents, but using demographics from management is the most common way we see this. It includes direct engagement and feedback from residents. And there are a variety of ways. Some organizations pick one. I'd say more organizations have multiple ways of doing this. You're collecting information usually from surveys, resident meetings, collaboration with resident leaders or focus groups. You might be doing individualized health assessments. We see that more frequently in senior communities. The tool, the document, should clarify how the information was obtained. So for example, if you're using a survey to engage with residents, when was the survey completed? What was the response rate that you had? Because you're creating a tool that's also your institutional knowledge so that when you're going back and referencing this data to think about how you're using it to shape other decisions down the line, you need to understand, the context for the information that you're looking at. And what did you learn? Some analysis of the information and data that demonstrates what you learned, and ideally it's going to point to the priorities that residents and staff have already identified for the resident services programming and engagement at the site. It should be included once every 3 years. On this tool, I also want to flag that we will be renaming this in the coming month or 2. Right now, you'll see it everywhere identified as a resident opportunities and needs assessment. It might be shorthand if written as RONA. We're going to be updating this language to resident opportunities and priorities assessment to reflect a more asset-based approach. It's the same tool if you wind up seeing something that looks a little different in the next month or so. So I like talking about the property services plan as a roadmap for what you're planning at the property. If there's staff turnover, this would be the go-to guide for somebody to understand the goals, programming, partnerships, staffing, and funding. What should be happening at the site? Again, it's both a planning tool, it's institutional knowledge, it's accountability. We've identified these 6 elements. 1, it should list your goals for programming. What impact are you hoping to have? You've done the work of the community scan and the assessments with residents looking at demographics. What have you identified as the priorities and what are the goals? It should include a description of programming and services. What are the core elements of your programs? If you're running health and wellness initiative, what does it include? Perhaps you have a visiting nurse, a fitness program, and a food access component. That should be described. Who's responsible for providing the services? I know. Often there's a blend of resident services staff and partners for implementing programming, but it should be clear for any sort of ongoing, more robust level programming, not one-off events, what's happening and who's responsible for implementing it. Staffing and partnership model. Describe the staffing you have. Do you have one full-time resident services coordinator that's operating at the property Monday through Friday from 9 to 5? Perhaps you have an on-site coordinator plus a youth engagement team who's providing additional support during evenings and weekends. It should be clear. It doesn't have to get into the specifics of the staff name, but what is sort of the commitment of staffing that's supposed to be present at that property. And it's also possible that a robust portion of the staffing support comes through your partnerships. So, you know, these different elements, who's responsible for providing the services, the staffing, the partnerships. You may not have 6 distinct sections in your program plan, but these elements should be reflected in the information that's captured there. Strategies to address identified barriers. This reflects some analysis of the cultural, language, or other types of barriers that may impact programming or outreach. Let me go back. You know, along with the strategies, the staffing or partnerships that you've identified to help address these. This is, I would say, there are places where we've seen property services plan where it sort of has a discrete description of this. Frequently, it's sort of wrapped up in some of the staffing and partnership descriptions. And for some, this continues to be a more aspirational goal of trying to more intentionally integrate this into property services plans. Oh, and finally, budget. What's the budget that supports the programming at the property? I would say frequently this is held in a separate document, but when you upload it, they can be merged into one tool. The property services plan should be updated at least once every 3 years. I would say a better practice is to review it and update as may be necessary annually as part of the budgeting process. Resident indicators and analysis report. So you've laid out your goals in the property services plan. Ideally, you've already identified your indicators for measuring your success at meeting goals and meeting those goals. This report is the tool that your organization is using to understand that impact. It should align with the property services and programming and the goals. It should demonstrate the value or impact of resident services at the property. It should demonstrate that an analysis has been completed, what's changed, and it's used to inform future changes. This requirement, I would say, sometimes creates a lot of anxiety for organizations, especially those that are a little newer to outcomes measurement. And I want to be clear that tracking program participation, while this is an output and not an outcome, still earns the minimum points needed to pass this threshold requirement. We recognize that participation is important to track. There's value in it. It doesn't get you to outcomes, but it is one step in that direction. CORES is really a fit for organizations that have either already developed their outcomes commitment and their outcomes driven, or in the process of developing that capacity. And we want to see organizations moving beyond tracking participation in the long run towards really thinking about and tracking impact. For those of you who are a little less familiar with thinking about and measuring resident outcomes, SAFE's outcomes framework, which is a list of measures that we've been using as part of our outcomes initiative, is available publicly. We're going to share a link to it. There are probably countless different kinds of measures that an organization can use and are valuable. We are not suggesting that you should use these, certainly not for CORES. There's no requirement, but we want to share these as a resource. So, as I think I've mentioned, there's no standard or required template for these tools. We list the elements and the functions of them, and we've created an application and scoring process to be flexible. We're looking to see that these functions and tools exist within your organization. And it's sort of up to you to demonstrate how you see these coming together. You may have 4 discrete documents that very closely align and encompass all these functions. You may also have put together a number of reports or tools, combine them together so that they're blended and that they demonstrate the elements and the functions of the community scan or the resident opportunities and needs assessment. In cases when you're packaging multiple tools into one upload, for example, community scan, we suggest providing a cover sheet with an explanation of how those elements, when combined, demonstrate the core elements of the scan. And it's okay if you have a tool that blends the elements of 2 or more required documents. So, for example, you might have a document that really combines the functions and learning of both the community scan and the RONA. Or you might have a document which combines even the community scan, the resident opportunities and needs assessment, and the property services plan. That's okay too. CORES reviewers will just really need to be able to clearly see those elements of each of those tools demonstrated into what's uploaded as part of the application. When these documents are well designed and aligned, you can see how the data from the community scan, the resident opportunities and needs assessment have been used to shape the property services plan. And the data that's being tracked in the indicators report aligns with the goals and the programming outlined in the property services plan. They really feed and shape one another in a cycle. So scoring. The application, as I mentioned, there are 6 sections: portfolio profile, resident services coordination, utilizing information about residents and the community, the program plan, funding resident services sustainably, and the evaluation of program success, A through F. You can sort of see the general breakdown across each of the models of the points. You must meet all threshold requirements, those 9 thresholds we reviewed. You must meet the minimum number of points in each of the 6 sections, the ones that are highlighted in red. And you must score 40 points across the entire application. You may note, if you spend some more time with this, that if you add up the minimum number of points in each of the sections, A through F, you will not achieve 40 points. You'll probably just get shy of there. The expectation is that you're going to score higher in one of these areas or multiple of these areas, depending on sort of where your organization's strengths are. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's going to walk through the typical application and review process and highlight a little bit more about how to learn about CORES and take advantage of some of our sources or other resources. So I will continue to drive the slides, Sarah, and just tell me when you want me to advance. And we cannot hear you yet. Can't hear you yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I had to switch to computer. Okay, so as Alexander mentioned, my name is Sarah Tori. I'm the Senior Health and Housing Associate at SAFE. We're going to start with the application and review process. So when you're feeling like your organization is ready to apply for CORES, ideally you're going to go back and maybe watch this recording. We have a couple recordings on our website just to refresh yourself on the process to get into the finer details. But once you're ready to start the process, you're going to submit a pre-screen. This is you certifying that your organization meets those 9 threshold documents that Alexander went over earlier. Once we receive the pre-screen, we will set up a TA call if we see any red flags or if there are any necessary questions to answer in advance. But if everything looks good, we'll approve the pre-screen. You'll receive a PayPal invoice that you can then pay for the $5,500 application fee. Once you pay that fee, an automated email will give you access to the full application. When you're submitting the full application, you want to be sure that you're submitting an application that fully represents your organization's system of resident services. So you're going to want to review the questions and make sure you're answering them fully and answering each component of the question. Once you submit your application, a SAFE CORES staff member will review the application, highlight any needs, anything that needs an update. Once there are no further updates needed in an application, the application will enter the 4 to 6 week review period. This review involves an internal scoring by CORES staff members. They will write up a scoring analysis. They will make a recommendation on the application, whether a full certification or a denied certification. Then CORES staff takes these materials, they share it with a peer review committee. The peer review committee comes from external stakeholders that are familiar with resident services systems. 3 people are pulled from that pool. They review the materials that CORES staff submitted to them, and then they either agree or disagree with the determination. CORES staff will then review the committee's feedback and then reach out to the applicant to let them know either the approval or the denial. If there is a denial, there's an option for a written appeal. Okay, next slide. On our CORES website, we have a lot of resources available to you. So you'll go to coresonline.org. This first tab with the CORES and the check mark listed will bring you to the CORES eligibility, will bring you to our FAQ, our glossary. We are updating the FAQ and the glossary regularly. This is also a chance to review which model you think that your organization falls into. You can go to next slide. Then you'll click the apply with the little pencil tab. That will bring you to more of the details around the actual application. So you'll be able to see things that might be beneficial to do before you're actually applying, a step-by-step guide, and then further down the page, you'll see these two links. We have one portal that's for the direct and hybrid applications. So you'll click that red box there if you think that is the right application for your organization. The third party is in a separate portal, so you'll click the blue link here for an organization that you think fits that model. You also see here that we are providing you with all of the questions to the application. We are not hiding anything, so you can prepare in advance, download these, and work through some of the questions before you start that process. Next slide. We've also designed a lot of tools and resources that are available on the site. So we've designed a resource library. So that final tab with the, I think it's a light bulb, brings you to our resource library. So there's one general resource library that is for capacity building tools and resources for the general system of resident services coordination. With COVID-19, we developed a more specific COVID-19 practitioners resource page. This includes resources around reopening, how have organizations continued to deliver services in a remote world, cleaning precautions, tools and resources from the CDC for flyers, basically anything that a resident services frontline staff or corporate staff might need in order to address the pandemic. Next slide. So this is just a screenshot of our resource library. And you can see here that you can filter through all of the different types of documents. So if you want to review what a community scan may look like from an organization, we have some here. You can see how that might adapt to what you have for your organization. Next slide. And lastly, just some ways that we stay engaged with the field. We have a quarterly newsletter that you can sign up for, and that should actually be coming out in the next week or so. So feel free to sign up for that here. I'm going to post the link in the chat as well. And we also host quarterly webinars. So we have our first quarter webinar coming up on establishing and maintaining partnerships. That's going to be on March 23rd at 3 p.m. or 3 p.m. Eastern, and you're more than welcome to register for that. I'm going to post that in the chat as well. All right, so that concludes our presentation today. We want to be sure to open it up for the Q&A and also give you our information for staying in touch with us more directly. But yeah, we're ready to open it up to the audience.
Anyone has questions? Were there any questions in the chat, Sarah, that came through that we didn't address?
There were not, no.
Okay. Any questions about any elements of the certification or the process that would be helpful to talk through in greater detail?
I know that one question that we received a fair amount, or question/comment throughout the 2021 QAP development process, was a gut reaction that a lot of it seemed really geared towards very, very large organizations. But I know y'all said there's kind of a variety of size of organizations that you've done this for. So if you could provide some context around that question, that would be helpful.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. So, if you look, we have a list of all the organizations that have achieved certification on the website. And there are many large organizations, but there are a lot of very small organizations. And as we were thinking about sort of that framework and how that applies in different locations and different sized organizations, it's very intentional. There are some elements of systems that, you get to scale the larger you get, but there's nothing that is impossible, or even if you're a very small organization. We have quite a few of the CORES certified organizations that have just a few hundred units of affordable housing. There are 2 or 3 groups that came in last year that have, I think, fewer than, 1 or 2 had 5 or 7 properties. There was one with, I think, 3 or 4 properties, but they were still able to demonstrate how that they had a systems approach to supporting that portfolio, and that they were really thoughtful, and that the staffing and their processes were still systems approach, even though the size of the organization and their portfolio was very, very small. So I think, as we've thought about it, talked with practitioners who have either gone through it or are considering it, we've tried to be very intentional to not make any requirements a burden that would block an organization or make it impossible for them to achieve this. It really does try to be more sensitive to a variety of different scales and sizes. Any other questions or concerns that we can help try to provide clarity around?
I can go ahead and watch the clock, and for several of our workshops in the past, we let a couple of minutes go, and if nothing more, and then we can call it. Recognizing that many of the questions will probably come once start going through the application process or exploring more deeply. So.
Absolutely. We provided the CORES email, cores@safenet.org. Please, as you're sitting with this, as you're talking to your colleagues or starting to think about how this might fit for your organization, please feel free to reach out to us if you want to schedule a sort of preemptive TA call, especially around sort of the models, or if you have questions about any of the requirements, we're happy to do that.
Well, my clock says that a couple of minutes of blissful silence has passed. So shall we call it? We will disseminate access information to the recording at a later time. And of course, CORES has provided further information, things for you to take a look at in the meantime. But thanks so much to the CORES team for putting together this very helpful presentation. And thanks to everyone for coming in and listening. So talk to you all later.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.